Good evening, everyone. My name is Sam Nasser, and this is the Cleveland C Sharp User Group. A little bit about the group. We meet typically every fourth Thursday. However, this is an out-of-band meeting, and the meetings are free of charge and open to the public. We cover a variety of topics related to .NET, and you can find all meeting information posted at meetup.com at the link posted at the bottom of the slide. We'd like to thank our sponsors for keeping the meetings going on a regular basis, PostSharp and DevExpress for sponsoring the post-meeting prizes, which will be given away using the eval forms, the .NET Foundation for sponsoring the Meetup site, and NIS Technologies for sponsoring the virtual meeting space. We'd also like to give a big thank you to Manning.com, 35% off a selection of books, with the link listed at the bottom of the slide and will be shared in the chat window shortly afterwards. In addition, you'll need the discount code MTPCLEC21 to be able to get the discount. Some general information about the group. Please keep in mind participation is always encouraged, so jump in with any questions or comments. And like I always say, the only stupid question is the one not being asked. So feel free to jump in and make it a very interactive meeting. However, when not speaking, kindly ask you to mute your microphones just to avoid any background noise. And we always like to keep it casual but organized. So although you can jump in with questions at any point, we want to give our speaker enough time to go through the presentation and the demos. Lastly, the presentation is being recorded and will be posted on YouTube shortly after the meeting's over. So for tonight's feature presentation, we have Finding Art in Code by Jon Skeet. Jon is a staff software engineer at Google. He comes to us live from Reading, UK, where he lives with his wife and 3 kids. And he's been working primarily on a .NET client library for Google services. He's also the main contributor to Node@Time, which is an alternative date-time library for .NET. And if you've been on Stack Overflow, you've probably seen his name as he is one of the top contributors. He also loves board games and stage musicals. And I know that he is sacrificing quite a bit to be able to join us at this time. It's about 11 o'clock right now in the UK. Is that correct, Jon?
Fortunately, it's only 10 o'clock. It would have been 11 at your normal time.
All right, very good. Well, thank you for taking the time to join us. And let me go ahead and make you presenter.
There we go. So hopefully you should now see my screen. And Sam tells me that you can control where I appear on the screen. So do feel free to move me around, shrink me, grow me, whatever it is. Thank you very much for having me. I was saying to Sam, it's been a little while since I've given this talk. I think the last time I gave this talk was on July the 7th, 2022, which was the day that Boris Johnson resigned as Prime Minister of the UK. Since when we're on our second Prime Minister since him. So this is a talk that I've given several times, but it always ends up being slightly different, and that would partly be because of any input that you can provide. It's not as sort of question obviously heavy as if I were giving more technical talk. Despite this being a .NET user group talk, there is a little bit of code, but not much. It's about code, but in a sort of thoughtful way. But just because there aren't questions of the kind, well, how would you do X, doesn't mean that you shouldn't ask questions. Quite the reverse. If you do have any thoughts, and don't worry about saying, well, this isn't so much a question as a comment, that's absolutely fine as well. If you have reflections on what I'm saying, then I'm sure everyone else will be grateful for the diversity of voices. Speaking of voices, mine is slightly hoarse at the moment anyway, and I have a streaming cold. So I hope you can hear me properly despite everything. We will see whether I need a break halfway through for 5 minutes just to have another strepsil and a drink of water. I will be taking drinks of water fairly frequently. But without further ado, let's make an actual start. I do want to start with a slide saying be kind. I started doing this several years ago, must be coming on for 10 years ago, at a Caribbean DevConf, which was as fabulous as it sounds, where I didn't want to present any slides, and the organizer said, well, we can just put a giant picture of you behind. It's like, no, that's a terrible idea. Why don't you just put be kind? Um, I think COVID has emphasized the need for us to be kind to ourselves, to others, and I'm sure you're all lovely, kind people, but it never hurts to have a little nudge so that next time you're understandably in a bad mood, something's just gone terribly wrong, and then your waitstaff delivers the wrong thing at a restaurant, then hopefully you can just take that millisecond and think, hey, John said be kind, and maybe that will be enough to calm things down or whatever. So treat this as a little nudge. Do not adjust your screen. This is blank. White. A blank page or canvas. The challenge to bring order to the whole through design, composition, tension, balance, light, and harmony. That's the opening line to Sunday in the Park with George, which is a musical by Stephen Sondheim and James Lapine from 1984. Now, normally at this point, I would give a warning that the presentation would include singing. However, you'll suffer enough with my hoarse voice tonight anyway. You definitely don't need me singing. We're going to talk about a couple of works of art, and we'll see three, in fact. And the first work that we'll talk about, and interlaced throughout all of this, is A Sunday Afternoon on the Island of Le Grand Jatte by Georges Seurat, who lived from 1859 to 1891. And this picture took 2 years to paint, between 1884 and 1886, and it's huge. It's 3 meters wide by 2 meters high, and it's currently in the Art Institute of Chicago as an example of pointillism. I was going to see this picture in September 2020 when I was going to visit Chicago. No prizes for guessing whether that happened or not. But over time, the painting was painted with fewer and fewer colours, and Seurat was painting with light and building from small things. He had sort of rules saying that he couldn't do two brush strokes on the canvas next to each other if the colours were next to each other in his palette, for example. He was just experimenting and playing with things. So that's one work of art, and the other is Sunday in the Park with George, as I say, by Seurat, and this came out about 100 years after the painting, and it is about the painting and about Seurat, but fictionalized. It's not intended to be a biography by any means. Now, I'm primarily interested here in Stephen Sondheim, who I happen to think was probably the greatest composer of stage musicals. James Lapine is brilliant as well, but almost all my experience of this is through recordings. I was going to see Sunday in the Park with George in June 2020. Again, no prizes for guessing whether that happened or not. It was then going to happen in 2021, and I still haven't actually seen this musical. But like the work of art, this was experimental. It was originally just 25 performances off-Broadway at Playwrights Horizons in New York, and the second act of the musical was only in the last 3 of those performances. Now, I've lost time when giving this talk before, going into too much detail about the plot, but it's about George and his girlfriend Dot, and George is a real obsessive compulsive painter and just dives into his work completely, and Dot is very much not. She's interested in all kinds of things and loves George, but wants him to pay some attention to her, and she runs off with Louis the baker after conceiving a daughter by George. There are loads of other characters and loads of layers of representation, but I mentioned George and Dot and their daughter because their daughter comes into the second act. So I talked about layers of representation. At various points you have actors, well, George arranging other actors who are playing characters, and they form the painting of a Sunday afternoon on the island of La Grande Jatte. So there's loads of sort of levels of abstraction you can think about, and it is very playful. In the second act, well, it starts with the characters who are in the painting complaining that it's really hot to be in a painting in a gallery somewhere. And then it skips 100 years into the future with another character called George and George's grandmother, who is George and Dot's daughter. And George in the present and George are played by the same actor, and Marie and Dot are played by the same actress. Various things, various actors are repeated across the two acts, and so are various of the musical aspects as well, in surprisingly subtle ways sometimes. So the person who really embodied this role was Mandy Patinkin. And if the name isn't familiar to you, well, these days maybe Criminal Minds, the first couple of seasons of Criminal Minds, may be more familiar. But if you're like me and a fan of sort of 80s films, then if I say, "Hello, my name is Inigo Montoya. You killed my father. Prepare to die." That's Mandy Patinkin in The Princess Bride. George, in the second act, visits Paris to try to reconnect with his great-grandfather's past and encounters the ghost of Dot, and it's all about discovering art and abstraction and doing the right thing for you. So, what's all this got to do with us? Well, we've got no code yet, but I want us to think about art and craft and engineering and how those sort of link together as this terrible picture is intended to make us think, and how that applies in our day-to-day jobs. You know, we may not think of ourselves as master craftsmen, which I realize is a terribly sexist way of putting it, but pinnacle of craftspeople. But we are exercising ourselves in art, craft, and engineering. I will try to tease apart some ideas about how you might define them, but I'm not trying to be definitive by any means. And we'll just explore how code relates to the ideas that Sondheim puts forward and puts into Seurat's mouth in terms of bring order to the whole through design, composition, tension, balance, light, and harmony. So let's start off by thinking about art, craft, and engineering, and start with art. So this is the third piece of art that we'll talk about at all, and this is by an entirely different artist called Joan Miró from 1963, and it's called Le Nez Vent. Now, I'm not an art expert by any means whatsoever. I don't know what I like. I don't have the understanding or the terminology. I don't have anything deep to know why I like this, but I know I do. And I know I love Miro's work from the 60s more than his work before or after. As it happens, I love this work of art so much that I have if I say a print, that sounds like it's just a modern production, but there were 50 or 100 of these printed, and I have a copy which is hors de commerce, which is not for sale, went into the artist's private set to collect. And as it happens, as of Saturday, I happen to have the picture in my shed. So this is the same picture that you are seeing in the PowerPoint, while I find another place to put that, because currently I have another Miro where that one used to be. But it's gorgeous. You can't really see from here, but there are sort of embossed edges down, and there's something wonderful about the green and the yellow that sort of escape from the slightly darker bit of background, and there's what I think of as the sun in the top right corner. It's just wonderful. Now I could paint something Miro-like, or go through lithography to do something mirror-like with lots of dots and a few swirly bits, but it wouldn't be good. It wouldn't be art. I don't have those skills. So thinking about code, what kind of code is like art? And to my mind, the primary example of this, and this is where .NET does come in, is linked to XML. Because API design really is interesting. And if you look at the link to XML method signatures and whatever, and see object all over the place, it looks like it's awful. There are loads of implicit conversions everywhere and explicit conversions. It's like, why would you have all of these conversions, things that take object and do radically different things depending on the kind of object that's passed in? But it just works. It is really beautiful to use. So what is it that makes for art in code? Is art ideas and invention? Well, there's definitely some relationship there. And not all art in software is in the code. There can be beautiful user interfaces, and I don't mean ones that you look at and they look, oh, how pretty, but I mean beautiful to use. The interaction of it just feels like an extension of your hands. But there's also a degree of consistency. So within fine art, there's an appeal to novelty. Whereas within computing, a beautiful user interface is one that is so self-consistent that you see a screen you've never seen before and you know exactly how to use it. I once used a piece of CRM software called Act 2000 with an exclamation mark after the act. And on the artwork, on the front cover of the box, back when you get boxes with software in, it said something like completely novel user interface. I don't want that. I want a user interface that feels familiar from other things I do. So it's a bit different from, you don't really want a work of art to feel particularly familiar. You want it to potentially feel really quite different and novel. I say that looking around at other Miros on my shed walls, which are familiar with the Lunévent because they're in the same series. But I think in computing there's a beauty in consistency and conciseness that isn't necessarily there in art. Fine art, I mean. What about craft? To my mind, for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to define craft as hard-won skill that allows art to be implemented. So I don't have the skills to do lithography like Miro. Even if I did, I wouldn't be able to create art, but it is a prerequisite that you have to have the appropriate skills just to do the job. And there is a fuzzy boundary between art and craft, certainly. Is API design in general craft or art? Well, you really need the experience of what works, but you also need some ingenuity as well. I would say that craft requires conscious study and time. And I think craft, particularly in coding, can't be purely theoretical. If you read all the books around coding, you can read clean code, you can read all the classics, every blog post ever written, but if you haven't written a line of code, then I would say you're likely not to be able to apply those in a craft-like way. And this is really difficult for us as an industry because we want to be able to provide shortcuts to people coming into the industry. And that's why we write blog posts and make videos. And we're great at, well, we put a lot of time into teaching each other new ideas. And this is what I found works and whatever. I don't think you can actually skip over the time. There's something about whether it's failing or just solving a difficult problem or trying 10 ways to solve a bug and then you find it was a typo, that those are to some extent formative experiences. but they have to also be conscious and intentional. But with pairing and mentoring, and whether that's sort of physical pairing, mentoring over Zoom, Stack Overflow posts, blog posts, etc., there is a lot of way that we can get experience transfer, but I don't think it'll be, it doesn't completely replace doing something lots of times and thinking about how you're doing it. So finally, we have engineering. And art, craft, and engineering feels like the opposite end of the spectrum from art, with craft somewhere in the middle. Now, I don't particularly like the term engineering here. It's the best one I've found for what I'm trying to think about. There are some people who really, really don't like engineering as a term and think software engineering is no form of engineering, because in other forms of engineering, you're usually doing something that you have done before and you can apply all the relevant prior art of the engineering that's gone before you. And in software engineering, if you're doing exactly what you've done before, then why are you doing it again? You can just copy paste. That's doable. But this is the more objective side of coding, and it still definitely involves skill, and it's closely tied to experience. So I would say if API design is taking craft and applying that to the art of coding, I would say things like benchmarking, fault tolerance, testing, continuous integration, build automation. These are all engineering tasks with varying degrees of craft applied to them. So to come back to Seurat's starting point of a blank piece of canvas, how do we, as software engineers, bring order to the whole through design, composition, tension, balance, light, and harmony? I will take a sip of water. If any of you have any questions or comments at this point, do unmute. Okay, not hearing any, I shall continue. Hopefully that doesn't mean that none of you can actually hear and just seeing me waving frantically. Let's start with design. And actually, I've got several sides on design because it's such an overloaded word. In the same way as a method is overloaded, it has lots of different ways it can be applied. And the first use I want to make here is intentional decisions. It's by design rather than by accident. Now, in Sunday in the Park with George is always deliberate. But it's actually the more spontaneous, much more spontaneous Dot who highlights the importance of making decisions. At one point, she has to choose between Louis the Baker and George. And she sings, and I will speak today, I chose and my world was shaken. So what? The choice may have been mistaken. The choosing was not. You have to move on. Now, when I ask this in front of people in person, I always get everyone raises their hands. Have you ever been paralyzed by indecision when it comes to code? We've all been there. It regularly happens to me. There's rarely a day that goes by that I don't have some sort of indecision. And one day I look forward to sometime having multiple options ahead of me, all of which are lovely. They've all just got, well, I could have this beautiful thing that has all these benefits and no drawbacks, or I could have this thing that has all different benefits and no drawbacks. But in reality, it's almost always, well, I can have this thing that's got this one benefit, but this load of drawbacks that I have to mitigate, or a slightly different positive thing and a whole raft of other drawbacks. It's always choosing between bad options. But we do have to decide. If you don't decide, for the most part, you'll never make any forward progress. Because that's a key trait of software, is that it changes over time. Very, very few, like my Nodetime project is really pretty stable. I spent relatively little time actually writing new code, But even so, there are still tweaks. I get new feature requests, very occasionally bug reports and things. But everything does change over time. And sometimes the decision you make is to postpone making a publicly visible decision. There are some things you can do to put off having to decide until later on. Because although some decisions can be reversed, most decisions actually in software, once you've decided to go down one particular path, it can be very, very hard to back out of that, if you've done a release, for example. So making choices can be hard, but there are three sort of meta aspects to decision making, and those are almost harder. Firstly, you need to understand what decisions you're making. And that sounds obvious, well, I decided to do X. Well, did you? Let's take an example. Here is a method declaration, and we'll say this is C#. This method declaration in itself expresses a load of decisions. I wonder how many, if you were to write down all the decisions that have been made in this, how many you'd come up with. It is an instance method. It's not an unsafe method, although it could be in an unsafe context. It's not a virtual method, and it's a private method. And those last two, virtual and private, are quite interesting, because if this were Java, then it would be named in a way that's unconventional, but it would have a different meaning. In Java, this would be package private or package accessible, and it would be virtual. Now, the thing I find interesting about those is those are just language defaults, that C# defaults to anything you can declare. It's as private as you can make it by default, with very, very small exceptions to that. In Java, things are package private by default. In C#, things are non-virtual by default. In Java, they're virtual by default. Now, C# and Java are sufficiently similar languages that you would expect, if we were consciously making a decision all the time, you'd expect the proportion of private methods versus, I guess internal is close to package private for Java. Not quite the same, but similar-ish. You'd expect that ratio of private to internal to public to be the same between Java and C#, and virtual to non-virtual to be roughly the same between Java and C#. But in reality, in the code bases I've looked at, and I would say Google code bases are generally better, and my guess is, it's been a long time since I've worked in Java on a very regular basis, but back in the sort of late 90s, early 2000s, huge numbers of Java methods that you would find in open source libraries like Apache Ant and things would be virtual and package private, just because no one had thought to decide or thought that they were making a decision. Now, there's an argument for removing the defaults here entirely, but there are so many things that you would then have to express. Do you really want to put private instance safe void foo just for this? Personally, I would put private void foo. I explicitly use access modifiers all the time, so maybe we don't want defaults for that. What about 3.5? Should we remove the default that means double rather than float? There's an option there. Personally, I think C# would have been a marginally better language if, like methods are sealed by default, non-virtual by default, I would really have liked classes to be sealed by default, so that you had to say, no, hey, I'm going for inheritance here. Like, you have to say if you want things to be abstract, but if you want to have a concrete class that you can derive from, that feels like something that you should be explicit about. But maybe, like there used to be at least, lots of people would say, no, you should never seal classes. It makes things impossible to test, and you should make all your methods virtual. That seems to have died down a bit, but maybe I'm just hanging out with the wrong people. But the alt.NET crowd back in the day used to very much be of that mind. So maybe we just say, okay, we don't have a default for sealed or unsealed. You have to be explicit every time. And then if you have to be explicit, you're forcing someone to think about it. There's often an idea, certainly in user interface design, and sometimes in API design, people say, oh, don't make me think. In Node-time, we take the exact opposite approach. If you're using Node-time for the first time, it could feel really quite intimidatingly large because we have lots of different types where they used to just be date time in .NET before even date time offset, let alone date only and time only. I kind of feel that the inclusion of date only and time only in .NET 6 or whenever they arrived, that was sort of a validation of what I'd done in Node-time, which was, you've got lots of types to pick from because there are lots of different concepts. You need to think, are you trying to represent an instant in time or a date and time in a particular time zone, or a date and time not in a specific time zone but with a UTC offset, or maybe one that we don't know what the UTC offset would be, it's just kind of local. I try to force developers to think and then make the results of their thinking as easy to express as possible. So when you read the code, you shouldn't have to think when reading the code because it's all very explicit about what you're trying to model and what you're trying to do. Whereas to my mind, when you're reading date time code, it's like, well, is that an unspecified date time? Is it local? Is it UTC? Are you actually only interested in the date and you're not using .NET 6 or later, so you've got to use date time? I very much prefer to think up front and then make the code readable. And I would say the sort of parallel thought to that is where there are defaults, make them kind of obviously wrong. If you do the wrong thing, you should know about it. So C# does that well by making things as private as possible. Imagine if this were public by default. Well, you could easily accidentally include a public method in your API that you didn't mean to make public, you'd just forgotten to put private. And suddenly you can't make any changes to that method ever, and maybe you put a typo in the name, but you didn't check it carefully because it wasn't going to be public. Well, if it were public by default, that's a bad thing. Whereas if it's private by default, then, well, if you meant to make it public, you'll know about that because people are saying, why can't I call this method? And then you can add it in later, and that's a safer thing to do. Next thing about design, and I'm going to speed over this a little bit quicker, is versioning. So this is where the craft kind of comes in because you need to understand what the impact of any decision is. What's the impact of fixing a bug? Well, sometimes it can be this is just a patch. Sometimes in order to fix a bug, you have to expose some additional bit of API, so it becomes a minor version. And usually not in bug fixing, but every so often you will want to think, okay, I'm happy to break people. I need a 2.0. I would say that 1.0 is the scariest number in computing because before 1.0, you can play to your heart's content. You can change anything you like. When you ship 1.0, your decisions are there and at least really, really hard to change. And partly, it's all about communication. There's a game called Hanabi, which is a card or tile game, depending on which version you play, which I have a good friend who describes it as a game of trust and communication. And that's really looking at the kernel behind the game rather than the game mechanics. But it is about you thinking, I will trust it's a cooperative game, I will trust my fellow players. They know something I don't know. I know something they don't know, but I will trust that they have made a sensible decision. Why on earth would they make the decision they've just made? They can't communicate very much at all, just like a version number. Like you've got 1.0 or maybe 1.0.0, very, very sparse amount that you can communicate. But yet we get Semver And, well, I will communicate that there's a breaking change. You need to be really careful before adopting this. Or you should be okay to adopt this, but then you probably can't go back, or you may not be able to go back without changing your code again. Or a patch release where you should be able to merrily go between 1.0.3 and 1.0.5, and your code should at least compile. If you rely on a bug fix and then back out the bug fix version, then obviously that will break things, but you shouldn't end up with a new compile time failure. Nearly there on design. I told you it was overloaded. When we're talking about decisions, it's important to know which decisions are deliberate. And that's why I state private explicitly. But you can't possibly document every decision you ever make. I contribute to something called the AIPs, which are API improvement proposals, sort of a set of rules that we use in Google for designing public APIs. And we have regretted over the years not documenting more about the reasons we have taken decisions. It was deliberate at the time, but I think it was the wrong decision not to record the reasons for the decision. But we can leave a sort of breadcrumb trail. We can't document every decision, but working out what you're going to document is a decision in itself. And I would say there are also the example of language design meetings. I don't know how many of you have read Eric Lippert's wonderful blog posts over the years. I'm delighted to work with Eric. I worked with him on C# in depth, and I now work with him in the ECMA language standardization meetings. But back when he was in Microsoft, he would dig through the language design meeting notes and tease out, what were the reasons for designing a particular feature in a particular way? And it was Eric who convinced me pretty thoroughly that being explicit about access modifiers was the right way to go. But intentionality like this is only one part of design. And another important point is representation. What you choose to represent. And Sunday in the Park with George is interested in layers of representation. And there's a mixture of myth and reality. There's always a mixture of myth and reality. When you go to the theatre, you are seeing someone pretending to be someone else. There's the reality of the actor and the myth of who they are portraying. In the case of Sunday in the Park with George, there's the further myth of, well, this was a real person, and he did paint a Sunday afternoon on the island of Granjat. And maybe some of the details are accurate, but some are mythologized. What we choose to model is important. And in visual art, the accuracy of how you represent things isn't always important. Like, Lunévent is not an accurate representation of the moon and the wind. A photo that happens to be in focus and is, a 16K photo as detailed as you can make it, well, that is reality, but isn't necessarily art. It may well be, but just being accurate isn't art. Likewise, in computing, we don't try to be completely accurate about what we're modeling because we need to lose things. I've shown here the statue and then a stickman. And that is part of our job as software engineers, is to lose information and work out what it's appropriate to lose, because the world is too complex for us to model it all in code. This is captured in Sunday in the Park with George in the second act. Marie is looking at the picture and she sings, "The child is so sweet and the girls are so rapturous. Isn't it lovely how artists can capture us?" It's finding that essence that's important and does everything we need, so that we can lose the unimportant details. And choosing how we simplify things is the craft and art of coding. And sometimes we can get it wrong. And I'll give one interesting, to me at least, example of how we can get it wrong. So in NodaTime, as you might imagine, we have the idea of a date. Now, I suspect if I come to you with what is a date, you would probably give roughly the same answer that we came into for NodaTime. It's a year and a month and a day of month. And if you were cunning, you'd say within a given calendar system. So today is year 2023, month 11, day 20 in November in the Gregorian calendar system. It's a slightly different date in the Julian calendar system. But, all calendar systems seem to have month, year, and day. Great. That's a good simplification. I don't need to treat dates from the Julian calendar system as being radically different from dates in one of the various Islamic calendar systems. Until we come to the wondrous or Baha'i calendar. That I had a feature request. Could you implement the Baha'i calendar system? Or in fact, the person came up with a pull request in the end for I've implemented the Baha'i calendar system for you. But I had this problem because the Baha'i calendar system, assuming my memory is correct, has 19 months of 19 days, which is 361 days. And then it has the days of wonder. They're extra days so that a year in the Baha'i calendar system is pretty much, I don't know whether it's always 365 or sometimes 366 days, just like the Gregorian calendar is. But those extra days that aren't in the 19 months of 19 days each are deemed not to be in a month at all. They're just the days of wonder. Now, frankly, I love the concept of days of wonder. I don't know much about the Baha'i religion. Most of what I know is the calendar system. But I didn't have any way of, I didn't have a nullable int for the month, which I guess you probably would if you were just trying to model the Baha'i calendar system without modeling anything else. You would make month of year a nullable int, and it's null during the days of wonder. I think we ended up with it being month 20, and that's close enough. But it was my assumptions and culturally based assumptions that made me lose a bit more information because I just wasn't aware of the Baha'i calendar. We'll move on from design to composition. And there are several aspects to composition as well. I won't go into as much detail as I did with design. But to some extent, all code is composition. How do you start coding? We make big things from small things. Or to put it slightly differently, we take a big problem and divide it into small problems. You don't solve the whole of an application in one go. You might do it in one commit if you really, really hate the maintainers, but you have to think in smaller terms. And value is added by how things are combined together. And that choice, that decision, that design is part of what provides value. You can take two things that in themselves seem trivial, and ideally in code they should all feel trivial if possible, but when you combine them, you can see how they're combined, but somehow you get more value than the sum of the parts. Now in painting, there's composition, there can be composition in terms of blending paint colors, but in terms of Seurat, there are the individual brush strokes, which are not just dots. So pointillism is a bit of a mistaken misnomer. They're actually mostly small lines, but those lines compose to form recognizable entities. And indeed, the colors form out of several different colors, you end up with the color of the object itself. And one of the one of the songs, Finishing the Hat, is particularly about red, red, orange, and goes through all the different colours, and the result is none of those colours. It's the blending of it. Even though they're never mixed on the canvas, they're mixed in your eye. If you want to see this in really fine detail, if you go to the Google Cultural Institute, you can zoom into anywhere on the Sunday afternoon on the island of Le Grand Jatte into exquisite detail. And if you've ever seen Ferris Bueller's Day Off, you might remember Cameron doing exactly that, sort of zooming in and in and in until he saw just, I think it's the hat of the girl in the middle of the painting in just the brush strokes. And then you can zoom out and see the composition happening. But that is artistic, but normally when we talk about composition in art, there are more conventional ways of thinking about it. It's about placement and sizing, having something in the distance and something close by, and the juxtaposition of the two. And in Seurat's work, there's also then the surround and a white frame around it. Packaging itself is an element of composition. And in fact, Seurat stretched the canvas and drew the surround, which is finely multicoloured, I think almost the last thing. So that was a very deliberate thing as part of the overall composition. I'll come back to how important packaging and being part of a bigger thing is in a bit. In terms of code, there's one obvious form that I sort of referred to earlier, which is, well, you start with a token like X or 10. You build statements, and then those statements form methods, and the methods form types, and the types form libraries, and the libraries form systems, and the systems combine into bigger systems. And you can think about microservices and the single responsibility principle. All of this is about composition. And where scalability and reliability are achieved through solid engineering principles, the choices of how you do that composition and where you divide things up, there's a certain amount of intuition there. And when I hear intuition, I also think craft, because it's not like we've just naturally got intuition about what makes things great. We've seen where things have gone well, we've seen where things have gone badly, and that is our craft. One way that composition happens is in terms of data types. And this is a little bit like building big things out of small things in terms of executable statements, but it's slightly different to that. The value in composition of data types comes from adding meaning. We've got data, but adding meaning to how those bits of data relate to each other, that is information. And that happens with naming and with choices. So, for example, if I were to give you two instants in time, well, if I call them like F and M, that means nothing. If I call them start and end, then it becomes clearer that this is intended to be some interval of time. And there is then meaning to that that just isn't in the individual parts of it. And there's something in choosing to compose like this that implies value and goodness. I will briefly digress into a different Sondheim musical. I told you I was a big Sondheim fan. One of Sondheim's most accessible and frankly fantastic works is Into the Woods, also with James Lapine. And at one point, the witch in Into the Woods sings, "Children will look to you for which way to turn, to learn what to be. Careful before you say, listen to me. Children will listen. Careful the tale you tell, that is the spell." Again, be grateful I'm not singing. But the tale you tell in code is how you choose to compose data types. You're saying this has some intrinsic meaning. If you look at code and see a class that has seemingly unrelated bits of data and you think, well, what have these got to do with each other? There's a discordance there. It feels wrong because the values are being contorted. Unless it turns out that you haven't seen the bigger picture and maybe some more documentation, suddenly you see, oh, these are related in that way, and it makes sense like that. And there will always be times that you kind of compose things because it's convenient, but it doesn't quite sit right. So you try to make that internal or private. But there is something beautiful about, I take these things and I put them together and suddenly you do see the bigger picture and it is so much more than the sum of the parts. Because once you've composed the data, you can then think, well, what operations, what methods, operators, whatever it is, make sense with that composed type that wouldn't have made sense on any of the individual bits and pieces. And finally, on composition, this probably isn't a particular revelation, but there is a kind of composition in both link and async. And I think when I started putting this talk together, async was probably fairly new. Link certainly wasn't, but I have been giving this talk for quite a while. And the fact that the kind of method that you can await within an async method returns something that you can await means that you can write asynchronous code and go down the chain. And we know that part of the problem with async really is that switching between an async mode and a synchronous mode is problematic in various ways. But the fact that it works at all for the async part is because you can consume what an async method produces. And that's very, very similar to link, where you typically start off with a sequence, an IEnumerable, and you can apply an operation like where or select, and what do you get out? Another sequence of a different shape, but you've got this pipeline. So you can compose, you can put the different pipes within the pipeline in different orders and do different things, but it's that composability that makes it really flexible and beautiful to work with. I suspect this has got something to do with monads. I am not a functional programmer. I've tried to understand functional programming multiple times. I would like to think that some of my natural tendencies would appeal to functional programmers, that I understand some things just through craft, even though I couldn't explain it. But I believe that has something around monads. And even when I do understand monads for 5 minutes at a time, I can't really express it properly. But it feels like I've kind of got hold of the idea and I can feel around the edges of it. And I can appreciate the beauty of it without understanding the background and the computer science behind it. And that's a little bit like my Miro work, that I'm sure experts in art could tell me what I like, tell me what I'm missing about the artwork. But even without that, there's some bit of it that reaches out to me. So the next things that Sondheim talks about in Sunday in the Park with George are tension and balance. And I've sort of cheated a bit by putting these together. Tension in art often has a benefit. And in fact, I wouldn't have known this, just as I don't fully appreciate Miro, I wouldn't have known this before reading a book about Sondheim's work. But even in Sunday in the Park with George, the opening sequence of chords has a tension to it. They're sort of split chords, arpeggio-like. And between each word in design, composition, tension, balance, light, and harmony, you get this split chord and some bits of scenery fly in and something's missing. And it turns out that the reason you think something's missing is because the bottom note of each chord is missing. And this isn't just that Sondheim's kind of forgotten what arpeggios look like. it's very deliberate, because after harmony, you get the full chord and suddenly you relax. There's been that tension in the audience built up musically in a way that I'm sure I'm not alone in not really appreciating it consciously, but you can feel it when it lets go. That's a great thing in art. Build the tension and relieve it. Tension in software is rarely a good thing. Tension between people expressed as angriness is not a good thing. Having a variety of opinions expressed reasonably politely and certainly respectfully is definitely a good thing. But we do seek balance. There will always be tension between competing demands of, well, I want to put lots of work into this so that it can be the best it can possibly be. Oh, but we've got to get it out last Thursday, and you've got these other things that you need to do. There are, we've got to pay down technical debt. No, we can't afford to do that. We need to ship the new feature. There's a balance to be achieved. There are tensions in something like Nodatime in terms of what do we make public versus what we keep internal. In Nodatime, you cannot create your own calendar system. In Jodatime, which Nodatime was originally based on and is broadly similar to JSR 310 Java.time, you can create your own chronology, your own calendar system. I found that so few people are going to want to create their own calendar system, and there's frankly no chance that you do it properly without talking to me about it anyway and there being collaboration. I just don't let you do it, and if you want to do it, talk to me, we'll put it into the Nodatime library properly. But that's a tension. I'm deliberately preventing you from doing something because I think it makes things simpler and stops you from shooting yourself in the foot. There are tensions in language design between different features, and well, we can make this feature better if only we didn't have this other feature that would be negatively impacted. And particularly importantly, there is work-life balance to be achieved. And this comes back to Sunday in the Park with George, because George sacrifices everything in his traditional personal life for the sake of art, because the art is the basis of his personal life. That is completely what drives him. He doesn't really think of it almost as work. It is what he does. In the song Finishing the Hat, think about this as being like being in the zone. He sings, finishing the hat, how you have to finish the hat, how you watch the rest of the world from a window while you finish the hat. You're so in the zone that stuff is happening around you and you're not paying attention because you're getting stuff done. And that sounds all negative, and I completely appreciate that. But at the same time, at the end of the song, he sings, look, I made a hat where there never was a hat. And that is the joy of coding. We create something out of nothing. Not on our own, in collaboration with all the people who have provided us the building blocks and the languages and the compilers and everything that's happened. Even if you're programming on your own, you are building on the work of others, but you are creating something from nothing, and that is joyous. But we don't have to sacrifice our lives. George sacrifices his relationship with Dot, and I hope none of us have to face that sort of choice. And I would beg you to choose life over work wherever you need to make a decision. Several years ago, I was working on a project and felt I had to put in stupid amounts of hours and get up very, very early in the morning, and I got mugged on the way to the station once, and people at my local church were saying, are you okay, John? You don't look well. And I didn't pay enough attention to that. I'm currently on a pretty stressful project, but I'm keeping an eye on myself. So please keep an eye on yourself and keep an eye on other people in your team. And if you think someone is suffering from stress, please say something. On a lighter note, pun not particularly intended, let's talk about light. Ironically, when talking about light, when I give this talk in physical conference halls, I have to check this slide beforehand because the sun here looks radically different in different projectors. And in a similar kind of way, the painting is an experiment in light. Most of it is in shadow, and the girl at the very center is in light and looking out. Everyone else is looking to the side, but the girl who is in the light looks out at you. So Seurat was trying to see whether he could get the brain to blend colors in the eye, and he achieves that beautifully. So how on earth am I going to tie this to software? Well, for the purposes of this talk, I will say that light is like transparency and openness. And you can think open source, and these days open AI models as opposed to open AI models. Not saying they're not open, just broader than just the company OpenAI. There's something about making things open and transparent where appropriate, and keeping things private where appropriate, and communicating all of that clearly. There is room for private things, and that creates attention in itself. What should you make public? What should you ask your users whether they're happy making public? If you can give them a huge benefit, but it means taking more of their data and maybe making them uncomfortable, even if they can't tell you exactly why. If I had more time, I'd go into a Google Maps example here. How do you judge that balance? But I would say there's an aspect of this which can be negative, which is when there's a deluge of data. When there's so much light, it is blinding. It is like looking into the sun. Imagine writing code and putting comments on every single line. And the comments almost certainly wouldn't be terribly useful because you can't have that much useful stuff to say. You get far more data, but less actual useful information. Likewise, if your users asked you, what do you know about me? Well, giving people a 20 gigabyte data dump and probably no information about how to interpret it, that doesn't help them nearly as much as a short summary of, well, I know this bit of personal information and these other things. So think about light in terms of providing more openness and transparency and useful information rather than just all the data in the world. The final aspect of the list that Sondheim starts with is harmony. And where balance is taking elements that are naturally in tension and finding a way to avoid them from pulling each other apart, but they are naturally opposed to each other. Harmony is taking elements that are individual elements, but they improve each other when you put them together, much like composition. And I tend to think of harmony in coding, not in terms of code, but in terms of people. How can we produce a harmony of people? And it may surprise you, but the word that comes to mind is humility. I don't know how many of you have played in an orchestra or sung in a choir, but one of the important things in both of those is knowing how to keep yourself soft. And this can be lost in teams where everyone wants to make their point. But sometimes you need to know when you've put your point across well enough, let someone else make their point, adjust your point of view. And a good team leader, can be like a conductor of a choir or orchestra, helping to make sure that where we need a bit more from the altos, that they swell. And when the basses are singing too loudly yet again, they're sort of dampened down a bit. So a good team has a good conductor, and a good team sort of helps the conductor to correct things. A great team doesn't need the conductor, doesn't need anyone particularly saying, hey, now I think we should hear from Claire because we haven't heard from her yet. A great team steps in, each individual, to make sure that we have correction with compassion, but that everyone is heard. And this is where diversity is important as well. I mentioned an orchestra before. One of my sons still plays in a brass band. Now, I love brass bands. There's a film called Brassed Off, which the soundtrack for it is beautiful. Love it. But it does all sound a bit the same. A rich orchestra with the kettle drums and maybe the grand piano and the harp and the strings and the various different wind instruments. And yes, you've got the brass coming in triumphantly. It's a different matter. There is something wonderful there. And this certainly is in terms of diversity of gender and race and cultural background and all kinds of other aspects. But it's also the other teams who are helping us in a bigger effort. I mentioned earlier on the surround of the painting, that there were all the dots around. Who are the dots not in your team, but who help make your team succeed? Are they support people? Are they sales folks? Are they the janitors in your building? Who knows? There are so many people, each with their own role to play. And we often play different roles and need different bits of software as well. Within my work in Google Cloud Platform, I write libraries or generators for libraries that require an API to be designed to start with. And then I need someone else doing samples for them, and someone building gRPC and protocol buffers, and the customer support team, and of course the customers. There are all kinds of people involved, and the harmony comes when we're all aligned and something beautiful happens. And everyone is influencing everyone else's work. And that's something that we can forget sometimes. And when I'm writing code or writing a design doc, that is the melody of the song I am playing or singing. And other people provide the harmony to that melody. But my song is providing the harmony to someone else's melody. Everyone has their own melody, and when we're all working together, we can be each other's harmony. But if everyone is just singing as loudly as they can, it will be a cacophony. So we have to be listening to each other with humility in order to achieve this harmony. It's not easy because it involves humans, and humans are always so much messier than code. So it's hard, and it doesn't fall neatly into art, craft, or engineering, but it provides the backdrop, the working environment for everything else we do. And that's why I'm glad that it's the last of these ideas, because I think it's the most important one. One final slide. Back to a blank canvas. I believe we are lucky to work in an area that has such a mixture of creativity and solid engineering. And I've tried to convince you that software is an artistic endeavor and it's grounded in engineering, and that's all important. And that it's much, much more than just the bits, that software without any humans to consume it or care about it is pointless. Human interactions are at the heart of everything we do. And we can always do more. The end of the musical has this wonderful line. White, a blank page or canvas, his favourite. So many possibilities. Thank you.
Oh, Very interesting approach to looking at code.
A bit different.
Indeed, but insightful nonetheless. So, wanted to pause for a minute and see if there's any comments in the chat or any questions. So, two great comments that I also echo their sentiments. Fantastic job as always, and love the talk. Anyone have any questions for Jon? Okay, we'll be going through a couple of concluding slides, but first of all, I want to say thank you. I know it is now past 11 o'clock UK time, so needless to say, highly appreciate you taking the time and the effort to present to us, and great having you, and we'd love to have you again in the near future if possible.
My pleasure. Yeah, let's do it again.
Excellent. Thank you, Jon. If I may, I'd like to take back the screen and share a couple of concluding slides. All right, so that was a wonderful presentation, and also want to conclude by mentioning that the recording of this presentation will be edited and uploaded to YouTube in just a few short days, just to allow for time for editing. If you would please subscribe to the channel, and you can get upload notifications. And let me go ahead and post the links for that in the chat. All right, so there's a few links posted in the chat window. One for the YouTube link, and others will be for the blog, which is where the tech events will be posted, and that is samnasser.blogspot.com. You can also subscribe to that to get updates. And last but certainly not least is the feedback eval. So there's a link for that also in chat. And if you would please take a moment to fill that out so we can provide Jon with some constructive criticism. If you joined us after the start of the meeting, we mentioned that there was a special offer from Manning.com for 35% off a selection of books. The link for that and the discount code are also posted in chat, so feel free to check those out. And with regards to events, being that we're towards the end of the year and the tail end of November, there isn't a whole lot happening right now. However, wanted to make mention that on November 30th is going to be Jeff Fritz presenting at this group on the latest release of .NET. And also on December 12th is the Global AI Conference. It is a 24-hour conference of various sessions regarding AI, free of charge and available to everyone. So feel free to check out that link and register for it. And one of the things that we always like to do is discuss job openings. So there are a variety of different job openings available at techsystems.com/IT-jobs. But we'd also like to ask who's hiring and who's looking for work. So feel free to come off of mute or enter it into chat. And while we're doing that, I also wanted to share a job posting that is available from the local Cuyahoga County. And this is as stated. It is going to be Monday through Friday flex, and the requirements are posted on the link, and I will also paste that into chat. If you do have other job openings available at your place of employment, feel free to share it with the rest of the group. In addition, you can also reach out to me afterwards, and I can share it with others. My contact information, snasser@nistechnologies.com. You can also find me on Twitter @SamNasser, and the link to my blog once again. And lastly, if we're not connected on LinkedIn, I invite you to do so. And so with that, thank you all for attending, and a big thank you to Jon Skeet for joining us from across the pond and having to stay up late to present. So thank you all, and look forward to seeing you all next month. Good night, everyone.